Welcome back to the Brown Surgery Podcast. Today we're going to tackle the topic of sedation in critical care with our local TICU pharmacist, Dr. Sean Whitehead. Our objectives for this talk are to discuss some of the common medications we have at our disposal for sedating patients in the ICU, particularly those who are intubated on mechanical ventilation. We will also discuss the formal assessment of patients with agitation and factors that should be considered when working up these patients. All right, so I'd like to welcome Dr. Sean Whitehead, PharmD, to the podcast today. Sean received his degree in pharmacy from Northeastern University and then went on to a residency in Colorado. He is board certified in critical care, and we're lucky enough to have Sean with us as part of our team in the trauma intensive care unit. He's been a great addition to the team. Sean, welcome to the Brown Surgery Podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
We've been doing this series on trying to get our residents up to speed, especially when they're taking call in the critical care units here with us. Sedation in the trauma intensive care unit is a common instance that our residents will find themselves in. So I was hoping that you could go over what the goals of sedation, especially in an intubated patient in the critical care setting, is and how we might best be able to assess level of sedation.
Yeah, I think it's a really important topic. Whenever I think about sedation in an intubated patient, the first thing I always ask myself is why do we sedate our patients? And the answer to that is to reduce the anxiety and the stress that's associated with mechanical ventilation or, any of the other procedures, invasive procedures that we're doing there. And what's interesting is, there have been studies that have shown that not all patients even need sedation. So there's some papers out of the Netherlands that suggest that, maybe no sedation is even an option for those patients. So we sedate our patients to make them comfortable and to facilitate, mechanical ventilation. So how do we do that? We should be targeting a certain depth of sedation that we assess with a standardized tool. And here at Rhode Island Hospital, we use the RASS score, which is the Richmond Agitation Sedation Score. And that looks at a level of sedation from -5 to +4. So the negative scores are patients that are sedated all the way to comatose, which would be a -5. And the positive scores are patients that are agitated. And there's been numerous studies that have compared lighter levels of sedation versus deeper levels of sedation and shown that lighter levels of sedation are associated with decreased time to extubation and decreased tracheostomy rate. And so it's important to try and target a lighter level of sedation as best as we can. And that would be a RASS score of 0 to -2. So that would be a patient who's either alert and calm, which is a 0, slightly drowsy, which means that they are not fully alert, but when you speak to them, so not physical contact, but just voice, they're able to open their eyes and maintain eye contact with you for more than 10 seconds. Or when they briefly awaken to voice, but they're not able to maintain that eye contact for a full 10 seconds, that would be a -2. So really, we want to be able to walk into the room and speak to our patients and have them kind of look at us and either maintain eye contact for some period of time. That's really where we're shooting for our light levels of sedation. Deeper levels of sedation, really patients require physical contact to be able to waken up. When you compare light levels of sedation versus deeper, there's really no difference in the incidence of delirium or depression or self-extubation, which I found interesting. But what we need to keep in mind, targeting that lighter level of sedation and using as little sedation as possible is really the goal here, except for certain patient populations where we just truly need to knock them out. Those would be your patients that are paralyzed, patients that are truly desynchronous with the vent, so thinking about like our ARDS patient population, patients that have increased intracranial pressure where we need to put them under deeper sedation to maintain their ICPs, or patients that are in status epilepticus that's kind of refractory to our first line therapies like our intermittent benzodiazepines or anti-epileptic therapy. Those patients may require deeper levels of sedation, but in general, targeting light levels of sedation to relieve that anxiety and stress associated with mechanical ventilation is kind of our goal here overall.
I sort of like how you broke that up between the light and the deeper level of sedation. I think specifically for this talk, when we're talking about sedating someone who is intubated, as opposed to just getting a procedure like a central line or a chest tube, we're going to need some of these medications to make these patients comfortable on a longer term basis. So I guess with that, what are our main choices of sedation for patients who are intubated in the ICU?
Yeah, absolutely. There's really three buckets of meds that they fall into, and I encourage anyone who's listening to this podcast to check out the PADIS guidelines. for a couple of reasons. They're put out by the Society of Critical Care Medicine, really the gold standard for pain, agitation, delirium, immobility, and sleep in critical care patients. So it's a really good read. But the second, and the more, I guess, personal plug is the first author is a pharmacist and one of my mentors from my days in Boston. So I encourage you to check out that guideline. But what that suggests is that the go-to choices should really be either propofol or dexmedetomidine, Precedex as you'll hear it called, and they're preferred over benzodiazepine therapy. And the reason why these agents are preferred over benzodiazepines is there's been multiple meta-analyses that have showed that they're associated with decreased ICU length of stay, decreased length of mechanical ventilation, and also decreased incidence of delirium. Choosing one of these agents is a routine recommendation for sedation in an intubated patient. Now, comparing dexmedetomidine over propofol, those guidelines aren't really able to suggest one over the other, carte blanche for all of our ICU patients. So when looking at, what's the decision between one of those agents, we really need to look at more patient-specific factors. So in a patient who requires sedation, dexmedetomidine may be associated with a decreased incidence of delirium. We've seen a lot more dexmedetomidine over propofol in more recent years. And what my kind of favorite to reach for dexmedetomidine is patients are able to wake up a little bit easier when they're on dexmedetomidine than they are in propofol. And the reason why I think this is important is pain, which we're not going to talk about, today, but pain can be a significant driver of agitation, particularly in our trauma intensive care unit patients. And if you have someone who's sedated, relatively deeply with propofol, it can be hard to determine what their level of pain is. And there's been some studies that suggest that with dexmedetomidine, you can kind of wake these patients up, assess their pain, treat their pain as appropriate, and remove that as a question of, is this a driver of their agitation? And that's a little bit harder with propofol. Even though propofol is a very fast on, fast off agent, it's a little bit harder to assess pain with propofol than it is with dexmedetomidine. Unfortunately, with dexmedetomidine, you can't reach deeper levels of sedation. So really a RASS of -2, maybe -3 is about as deep as you can get with dexmedetomidine. So if you really need deeper levels of sedation to facilitate procedures or for some of those other indications that we talked about, propofol is going to be the go-to agent in those patients. Two particular instances where benzodiazepines do remain important are alcohol withdrawal or patients that are having seizures. So propofol does have some anti-seizure activity, so that could be an option there, but dexmedetomidine does not. So it is not going to prevent seizures in someone who is undergoing alcohol withdrawal or someone who is having active seizures. Dexmedetomidine would not be an agent that you should use in that patient. It does not have any GABA activity to inhibit those seizures. So I actually recommend shying away from dexmedetomidine in those patients because they will look sedated and they can be seizing, and that's makes it harder to assess that.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, there is literature using dexmedetomidine in patients who might have alcohol withdrawal, but as you pointed out, you should be using them in conjunction with some benzodiazepine because of the seizure threshold there. Can you just speak, because the practice too here, we tend not to bolus dexmedetomidine before you start someone on a continuous drip. Can you just speak to that quickly?
Yeah, so unfortunately, dexmedetomidine has a fairly long onset of action. So at best, it will kick in about, without a bolus, at best it will kick in about 15 minutes. And in my clinical experience, it's more 20 to 30 minutes is where you see that onset of action. And that's when it was originally studied, and dexmedetomidine was initially used by anesthesia. To kind of get around that, they gave a loading dose. So the way that dexmedetomidine works is it's an alpha-2 agonist. And the loading dose actually will agonize the alpha-2 peripheral receptors. And what you'll see is hypertension and tachycardia as you get that peripheral activity of the dexmedetomidine bolus. And then as it moves more centrally, we'll see a large decrease in heart rate, and you'll see a large decrease in blood pressure. So you get kind of this very large increase in heart rate and blood pressure, followed by this large drop in heart rate and blood pressure. And a lot of patients don't tolerate that swing very well. For that reason, I generally don't recommend dexmedetomidine boluses. I think that there are other agents. If you need something to act faster, giving a one-time dose of a different agent, whether it be a benzodiazepine or actually my preferred would be like a fentanyl bolus, to get that something with that fast onset of action while that dexmedetomidine kicks in, is my preference. And then just another plug, starting dexmedetomidine at a dose that you think is going to be effective is also important too. So, if you're trying to wean someone off propofol to dexmedetomidine, and starting them at 0.2 of dex, which is what our protocol appropriately says to start at, is probably not going to be effective. So usually something in the range of 0.6 to 1 is probably where you want to start, and then you can wean down or up from there. But someone that's on 30 or to 40 of prop is probably not going to be super happy on 0.2 of dex. So
I think that's a good segue into this next topic here. You mentioned some of the hemodynamics of using dexmedetomidine. You can see some hypotension associated with these loading doses, but are there better agents to select based on the hemodynamic profile of our patients? Obviously, a trauma population, whether they're in hemorrhagic shock or sometimes septic shock, we have some derangements in their hemodynamics. They're tachycardic, they're hypotensive, yet we still have to intubate them and make them comfortable. So what would your choice be for those patients?
Yeah, so for your hemodynamically unstable patients, and the ones that are extremely hemodynamically unstable, benzodiazepines are going to be the most hemodynamically stable choice. I know that goes counter to what I was saying, where dexmedetomidine and propofol are preferred agents. But if you rising pressor requirement, you have a patient who's on 1 and then 2 pressors, and you have them on dexmedetomidine or propofol, that may be a time to switch to a benzodiazepine based protocol, to see if your sedation is contributing to their hemodynamic instability. In my experience, patients that are volume down are more sensitive to the hemodynamic instability that comes with dexmedetomidine or propofol, but that is not always the case. And so to eliminate that as a factor, your benzodiazepines are going to be an option in those patients that are really have escalating pressor requirement. If you're not exactly sure what's going on, is this septic shock, is this hypovolemic shock or cardiogenic shock, that could be an option. But when comparing some of our two workhorse agents, dexmedetomidine versus propofol, dexmedetomidine is definitely associated with more bradycardia than propofol, and propofol, generally speaking, is associated with more hypotension. And now that's not always true for every patient. There's an interesting crossover trial that put patients on a propofol infusion, switched them over to dexmedetomidine, and then switched them back over to propofol, and found that norepinephrine requirements were significantly higher in patients that were on propofol. So we tend to think that propofol drops blood pressure a little bit more than dexmedetomidine, but in my experience, it's definitely patient specific. Some patients are very sensitive to dexmedetomidine and not so much to propofol. So I think there's a little bit of a trial and error there. To talk about it mechanistically, propofol decreases your systemic vascular resistance. So it's a vasodilator. And this is in dose-dependent fashion. So the higher your propofol dose, the more vasodilation you're going to get, and the lower your blood pressure will go. So if you can put someone on propofol at lower doses, that tends to be a really hemodynamically stable option. Dexmedetomidine, it's not so much dose related. It tends to just be how sensitive patients are to that alpha-2 agonist activity. So it's a little bit of a trial and error between those two agents. But if you really have a crashing patient, switching them over to a benzo, as much as that pains me as a pharmacist, that may be the option there.
No, I think that's a good point. And is this something where you're going to transition right from a propofol drip to a midazolam drip? Is it a case where you should just try to do some intermittent bolusing of medications? And I guess my question there, when should we be using intermittent bolusing of medications versus a continuous drip? Obviously, we want to keep our patients somewhat awake so we can extubate them and have decreased stays on the ventilator and decreased hospital stays. But how does one of our residents who are managing these patients, how do they make the choice between using intermittent bolusing versus a continuous drip?
So I think if there's one thing that people can take away from this podcast, it's that let your patients fail intermittent boluses of benzos before you put them on a drip. Continuous infusions of benzodiazepines are always associated with increased benzodiazepine utilization. And what we know, which is consistently borne out in the critical care literature, is benzodiazepines are associated with delirium, and that delirium increases ICU and hospital length of stay. So the less, if we do have to use benzodiazepines, the least amount of benzos that we can give our patients is going to be, best for them. We should be trying to use intermittent boluses and trying really hard before we put them on an infusion. And even if we do have to put them on an infusion, make sure that you're using intermittent boluses as part of your infusion protocol. So if someone is put on midazolam drip at 2 milligrams an hour, they have breakthrough agitation, give them a bolus of midazolam, see if that calms them down, because increasing from 2 milligrams an hour to 4 milligrams an hour, that's not going to rapidly decrease their level of agitation because that increase of 2 milligrams is spread over an hour-long infusion. And so what you can see is, if you're not using intermittent boluses, even in patients that are on infusions, you see rapidly escalating, rates of your infusion to where someone's on 10, 12 milligrams an hour, and then they get accumulation of the drug. Really starting out with an intermittent bolus protocol. Our TICU sedation protocol utilizes lorazepam for intermittent boluses, and that's based on some of the pharmacokinetics of the drug. Lorazepam, as compared to midazolam, has a little bit longer of a half-life, meaning it will stick around a little bit longer, and it's extensively hepatically metabolized to inactive metabolites, meaning if someone has a functioning liver, they should be able to metabolize that to an inactive drug that can then be cleared by the urine. So as long as someone has a functioning liver, they should be able to clear the drug. The half-life is around 14 hours, and so it should stick around for you. And dosing is anywhere from 2 to 4 milligrams would be a good starting place for an intermittent bolus. And lorazepam can accumulate in patients that do have renal dysfunction as well, just because it has a long half-life. Comparing that to midazolam, midazolam does have a much faster onset of action. That's why we like to use it for procedural sedation. It's a little bit more lipophilic, so it gets to the brain a little bit faster, and that's why it has a faster onset of action. But it has a little bit shorter and actually a significantly shorter half-life, so it doesn't stick around as long. That's why midazolam is our go-to when we do need to use a continuous infusion. You don't get as much accumulation with a continuous infusion of midazolam, but unfortunately, it is hepatically metabolized to active metabolites that do have sedative activity. So what this means is even if someone has a functioning liver, they're metabolizing the midazolam, but they're metabolizing it to active metabolites that need to be renally cleared. So you need to be really careful with midazolam in patients that have both hepatic and renal dysfunction, because either the active drug or the metabolite can accumulate. What I try to do is, if we just decide to do a benzodiazepine strategy for sedation, choose the agent that I think is appropriate based on their liver and their renal function. Start at a dose that I think is going to be effective. So remembering that lorazepam is significantly more potent than midazolam. So to give you an approximate reference, about 1 milligram of IV lorazepam is approximately equal to about 2.5 milligrams of IV midazolam. So, if you're starting, at a dose of 2 milligrams of lorazepam, that's maybe 4 to 5 milligrams of midazolam, and then kind of going up from there. And then basing, how much benzodiazepine you want to give based on what their RASS score is. So for higher RASS scores, more agitated patients, they may require a larger dose of whichever benzodiazepine you choose. But let them fail an intermittent strategy before you switch them over to a continuous infusion.
As we think about these patients, we can't leave them on propofol or dexmedetomidine continuously. We have
Sure.
to try to balance their sedation with waking them up and trying to get them extubated. So how do you go about that process? And is there a medication that you suggest transitioning off of propofol or dexmedetomidine from?
Yeah, I think this is one of the hardest things about sedating the critical care patient is how do you get them awake enough to be able to extubate them if their lung function is going to allow you, or some of the other factors that limit extubating a patient. Unfortunately, I don't have a great answer for you, Kenny. But there's some things that we can do that are part of high quality critical care of these patients, and the first is to always use the least amount of sedation possible to achieve your goal RASS. So constantly reassessing your patients and looking at the RASS score to titrate your sedation is going to be most appropriate. I think where it gets a little confusing for our residents that are in the trauma ICU is that the GCS score is drilled into them. And the GCS is a great score for those patients that have a traumatic brain injury, and it's very useful for prognostication for those patients that have traumatic brain injury, but it is not useful for the active titration of sedation in patients. And so on rounds, I'm always trying to remind the team it's important to tell us what their GCS is today, but what's their RASS score, and how deeply are we sedating them? And are we getting a 0 to -2? If they're agitated, when are they agitated? Is it daytime? Is it nighttime? And what do we think are the sources of their agitation? And trying to treat those sources of agitation as much as possible. And unfortunately, there is a million and one different reasons why an ICU patient could be agitated, but I just want to, run through some of these as much as possible, because we should really be targeting that source of the agitation and eliminating that as best as we can, and that will reduce our overall sedation needs, as opposed to replacing our continuous sedation agent with a longer acting sedation agent, which sometimes is absolutely appropriate and necessary. But unfortunately, when you institute those long-acting agents, they can have long-acting side effects, like akathisia is a very common side effect that we see when we expose these patients to these atypical antipsychotics like olanzapine and quetiapine, and patients can get agitated because of that. So now we're not sure, is the agitation because of the drugs that we're giving them, or is it because of some other source? So really, trying to treat whatever their ultimate source of agitation is, and checking off all of those boxes, and then as needed, transitioning to a longer acting sedative. So pain, really looking at, are they having pain from chest tubes, Foley catheters, surgical pain, trauma pain, patients that have a full bladder or full colon, so making sure that our patients are stooling, eliminating those as sources of pain. Making sure that their agitation is not from hypoxia or from hypercarbia, which can cause agitation, or if there's ischemia, so if it's intestinal ischemia, myocardial ischemia, cerebral ischemia, thinking about infection or sepsis as a source of agitation, alcohol withdrawal, benzo withdrawal, nicotine withdrawal. Those are all going to have different management of their withdrawal symptoms. Restraints actually can cause agitation, so trying to minimize restraints as much as possible. Sleep. Sleep is a huge risk factor, or sleep deprivation is a huge risk factor for causing delirium, and then delirium causing agitation. So really making sure that our patients are getting good sleep, as good as they can in the ICU. So, shades up, lights on during the daytime, shades down, lights off, TV off at nighttime. Trying to reorient your patients as much as possible to the day, the month, the year, where they are. Involve family. I know in this COVID time, it's a little bit harder to have as much family at the bedside, but really having family at the bedside to help reorient and redirect our patients. Facilitating communication while patients are intubated, so utilizing a whiteboard, or if we have someone who's trached, trying to get them to use the Passy-Muir valve, so that way some patients who can't communicate, that's a significant source of their agitation. And then really looking at drug side effects. So I really try and limit any anticholinergic agents that can cause delirium and can cause agitation, and even benzodiazepines. Some patients have a paradoxical response to benzodiazepines that can make them be agitated. So really focusing on any of those potential sources of agitation and trying to remove those as best as possible. If I've done all of that and patient is still agitated and dexmedetomidine is an agent where patients can be extubated on dexmedetomidine. So it's nice that it is not a respiratory depressant. And so you can utilize that to facilitate extubation. If their agitation, we believe, is just from the endotracheal tube, then you keep them on the dex, you extubate them on the dex, and then once the tube is out, theoretically, some of that agitation should go away. Now, all of those things sometimes don't work in some of our patients, and so we need to put them on some agents to get them off of the propofol or the Precedex or the Versed drip, midazolam drip, excuse me. My practice has really changed over the years as to what's my preferred agent. Quetiapine has the best study, but it's a very small study. It is associated with the lowest risk of akathisia, and so that may be a nice agent. If you do use quetiapine, I recommend starting at 50 milligrams 3 times a day. That's the way it was kind of studied. And, titrating it up where maximizing your nighttime dose can be helpful to help patients sleep, and then hopefully removing that as a risk factor for causing delirium and agitation by them getting a good night's sleep. So quetiapine does have significant antihistaminergic activity, and that's kind of why it sedates our patients. And that's where it's helpful using a larger nighttime dose to kind of help those patients sleep. Another agent that kind of has somewhat similar activity from that perspective is trazodone. So using nighttime trazodone to help our patients sleep. It also has some serotonergic activity, so it can be a little bit of a mood stabilizing agent, and also should have a relatively low risk of akathisia. So it's another agent that we employ for sleep-wake cycle normalcy, and then combining that with melatonin or Ramelteon, Rozarem, which is a melatonin receptor agonist. Those are all kind of good options to think about first line.
Your dose of trazodone you recommend?
Yeah, so dose of trazodone, typically about 50 milligrams QHS. You can start at 25, but usually I find 25 milligrams to be ineffective. So I usually start at 50 milligrams unless it's a larger patient or younger patient. You may just start at 100 milligrams, but 50 is usually a good starting place for most patients.
Well, Sean, I think this has been a great review. I really appreciate you coming to chat with us today about this. Every single night in the TICU, one of our residents has to sedate someone. So I think this will be a good resource for them to help them in their choice of pharmacologic management of these patients.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it.
Thanks again to Dr. Sean Whitehead for joining me today on this podcast to discuss sedation in the critical care setting. Links to the Richmond Agitation and Sedation Scale, as well as the PADIS guidelines that Sean mentioned in the podcast, are available in the description. I encourage you to check those out and familiarize yourself with them when you have time. Just a plug to please email me if you have topics or ideas for future podcast episodes. Thanks for joining us today, and I'm looking forward to having you back with us in the next episode.